Peace, everybody. Welcome to the Food Literacy for All class, second to last class. Today we have Dianne Glave, Reverend Dr. Dianne Glave, who will be presenting on Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming the African American Heritage. And as always, we have to give a thank you to our sponsors and our generous support. The Residential College, Dr. Kyle White, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center, the School of Public Health, and of course, the School for Environment and Sustainability, known as SEAS, and the Department of American Culture. And food literacy is led by a triad, myself, who's a lecturer in SEAS, Dr. Jessica Walker, who is an assistant professor of Afro-American and African Studies and an assistant professor of American Culture, and Lily Shapiro, who's the program manager for the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. And let me say, it's been an honor to work with these two folks. And so I hope that you all have been enjoying the course. Of course, we have more team members who can make this class happen. Without the GSI support from Megan and Nyexti, it would not be possible. And of course, want to give enormous gratitude to Kimmy Van Wedge and Chris Taylor for their external support on coordination and technology. And of course, as you all know, again, this is redundant. This course is free and open to the public, and there will be a Q&A at the end of today's sessions. And if you are a community attendee, there are optional readings available on the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative website. And please love us up on social media. We have a Twitter. Here's the hashtag and the handle, and poll questions are used to take attendance and participation at each class. And so students that are enrolled for course credit, please be mindful that you're taking the polls accordingly. And as you know, all classes are filmed and available on the website. So now I'm going to hand it to Jessica.
So as many of you, of course, know, Geo is still on strike on campus. They are striking around a number of negotiating points, primarily cost of living adjustments. And our GSIs do quite a deal of work for this course. They handle grading, they coordinate between each other to make sure that your questions are answered around assignments. They handle a large amount of course communication, so they do quite a bit for the course. We do not have an idea of how long the strike will last, and therefore not a clear picture at this time around when delays will last. As stated a few weeks ago, previous year strikes have ended after 3 or 4 days. This is maybe looking like it'll go into the end of the semester. So with that in mind, we also want to remind you of a few course adjustments. All future quizzes will be postponed until further notice. These points will be subtracted from your course total. Participation grades will be collected, but grading will be delayed. So when we say grading will be delayed, either in Canvas announcements throughout the week or here, we do not have a sense of when those will be updated. Of course, you are the best kind of tracker of your attendance. You know if you were here or not. So that is something that you can keep track of yourself. But we will let you know as soon as we have a better picture around when those delays might end or what that might look like for you. But please do see our Canvas announcement for the last few weeks on more information. And course communications, your first step should be to look at, especially because you have upcoming your capstone. We have a number of frequently asked questions. There was a note there added around reflections and expanding the range of your infographic deck from 5 to 8 to 5 to 10. So it gives you a few more images to work with. Then look at your teamwork guidelines, look at your teamwork contract, make sure everyone is doing their part and playing their role and communicating effectively. And then looking at the syllabus. And then if you do need to contact me for any reason, use Canvas Messenger and give me a few 48 hours to respond. So again, use Canvas Messenger and give me a few 48 hours to respond. Just another reminder that our last class of the semester is happening next week, next Tuesday on the last day of classes. where we'll think about putting this all together. What would a synthesis of this theme for this iteration of the course look like? Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Reverend Dr. Dianne Glave received her master's in divinity and faith, health, and science from Emory University and a PhD in history with an emphasis on African American and environmental history from Stony Brook University in New York. She is the author of Rooted in the Earth, Reclaiming the African American Environmental Heritage, which is a book that I highly recommend and love. It's great to teach with, it's great to learn with. She is also the co-editor, along with Mark Stoll, of To Love the Wind and the Rain, African American Environmental History. Her scholarship to me represents really some of the earliest thinking around environmental history and African American traditions and wanting to really popularize these histories. And I'm really have always been impressed by how she touches on things that are fraught, that also teach us a lot about discriminatory labor practices or beauty or spirituality. And I'm really excited to have her this evening. She is currently the coordinator of diversity development for the Western Pennsylvania Conference of the United Methodist Church. So please help me welcome Reverend Dr. Dianne Glave.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. I appreciate that introduction. I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to be part of the Food Literacy for All class at the University of Michigan. And many thanks to Dr. Tyler, Dr. Shapiro, Dr. Walker, who organized the logistics for my talk and our conversation today. Now, in this first slide, African Americans are gathered together for baptism in Alexander Grinninger's painting, which isn't dated. He lived from 1865 to 1949, so sometime during those years, latter part of those years. At the center is an elderly woman, and perhaps on either side is the pastor and a leader of the church. Note that both are male, reflecting gendered roles in the Black church. They may be Baptist, the largest Black denomination of that era. Now, there are connections to Christian rites of water, baptism, affirming faith, symbolizing the Holy Spirit as eternal life, and African spirituality, including water being sacred and water spirits. Wanted to take you to our poll. And our first question is nature, we're doing the second question. Is our relationship with nature and the environment racialized in the US? You can answer yes or no. So we're going to give you 60 seconds to respond to the question, and then we'll take a look at what you all came up with. Again, the question is our relationship with nature and the environment racialized in the United States? And it looks like we have 88% yes and 12% no. And 12% no. Okay. Some high numbers there. Let's take a look at the next poll. Has race or ethnicity defined land ownership and access to green space? And again, it's a yes or no answer. Has race or ethnicity defined land ownership and access to green space? And again, we'll do about 60 seconds before the total of the polls come up. All right, so it's 94% say yes. Race or ethnicity has defined land ownership and access to green spaces, and 6% no. I'm hoping that those who were in 12% and 6%, I may be able to sway you a little bit with what I share today. I argue that nature has long been racialized and contested around the world and here in the United States. I also want to tell you that there are positive stories. There are stories of redemption and joy for people of African descent. So I'm originally from Queens, New York. I was born and raised and proud to be from Queens. That was a place for me that was of concrete and asphalt, also patches of grass, because in some ways it was suburban. And in our little home in Queens, we were right near GFK, and we stopped hearing the rumbling sounds of the planes departing and taking off. So that was my life in part in Queens, from an environmental perspective. My parents are Jamaican, and they would take us to a place called Baker's Camp, which is in upstate New York. So that was my first real exposure to nature. And I found that I wasn't really afraid, even as a young child, to wander around what was considered safe when we went to the camp. I also lived in New Orleans and lived there for a year, and it had a profound impact on me. Just an amazing, beautiful, green place. The other piece that was transformative was that I had to evacuate twice, and the second time was because of Katrina, and that certainly had a huge imprint on me. I traveled to Atlanta and stayed there with my brother, and there ended up writing one of my books, and now I live in Pittsburgh. One of the things that's impacting me now, and it's always like a low hum, is what's going on in the Ukraine and the war and the impact that it's having on us in terms of our foodways. Even thinking about the price of wheat, because a lot of that comes out of the Ukraine and also Russia. Russians seized a Ukrainian power plant. Utilities, including plumbing, electricity, and heat, were decimated by Russians bombing the Ukraine. And we shouldn't think that we are immune from all of this, because there have been attacks against utilities here in the United States. We also think about COVID, and that reconfigured all of our lives. We were more centered on home. The housing market was transformed, and that shut a lot of people who were middle income to impoverished in terms of finding rentals or even buying homes. And it also laid bare the higher mortality rates for BIPOCs, for persons of color and impoverished people. And then everybody got a dog. I got a pet. His name is Marley. In front of my house here in Pittsburgh, there's a little patch, and it has sustained me and reminded me of my Jamaican father's vegetable garden that seemed quite haphazard, but was really very African in the way that he planted. And then I also reflect on my travels, national parks, Joshua Tree to Glacier National Park. I don't know if the glaciers are still there, but I wanted to get there before they were gone. And then I felt a profound experience in Machu Picchu in Peru, in the gardens of Versailles in France. In some ways, it was very spiritual, especially Machu Picchu. So a little bit about me. So I wanted you all to reflect on what's your story, your ancestors, narratives you heard about. And I want you to think about all these things as you reflect on what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I want you to think about your ancestors. I want you to think about stories that you've heard around the environment from others, experiences at school and work. And I want you to continue to think about these questions as we move through our time together. So at the center of it all is really dealing with time, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And when we think about people of African descent, particularly here in the United States, African Americans, there are stereotypes that African Americans do not like nature. They're not interested in nature. But like all people, people of African descent are complex and not a monolith like all the people across this planet. Everybody has a story to tell. Different places, there's difference. Africa is not the same as the Caribbean. Europe is not the same as South America. North America is not the same as Africa. And we cannot put people in Africa and people here who are African American in the United States into one way of being. When we look at African Americans, they're affluent to impoverished, they're rural, they're suburban. Some either despise or are ambivalent about the environment because of forced labor. or exploited as sharecroppers in the early 20th century and not owning their own land. There's also love and appreciation of nature going back to African roots, agrarian people, and a great profound connection to water. And so there's a mix of both preservation and conservation. Some African Americans blended both. Conservation was using valuable resources like water and oil. Preservation was a way of protecting and appreciating nature. Now, in some white circles in the early 20th century and even today, there is a bifurcation. Now, George Washington Carver was born enslaved and went on to become one of the most prominent scientists and inventors of his time, as well as a teacher at the Tuskegee Institute. Carver devised over 100 products using one crop, the peanut, including dyes, plastic, and gasoline. So here's what George Washington Carver has to say. Unkindness to anything means an injustice done to that thing. If I am unkind to you, I do you an injustice or wrong in some way. On the other hand, if I try to assist you in every way that I can to make a better citizen and even every way to do my best for you, I am kind. The above principle applies with equal force to the soil. So let's think about transitions. And these are historical transitions. We're going to be looking at African spirituality, Middle Passage, enslavement, environmentalism in music, and environmental justice. I wanted to share a bit with you from Rooted in the Earth. And if you have the book, it's on page 43 to 44. And the beginning of the chapter is called Shouting in the Woods. The gatekeeper is Minka, a young man a few years beyond his initiation into manhood. And this takes us back to Africa. He stands with his head wrapped and body draped in white before the entrance of his village's earth shrine in the yellow-white afternoon sun in Ghana. He guards a place of worship where community members offer animal sacrifices to increase soil fertility, allocate land to members of the village, ceremoniously bury their dead, and venerate their ancestors. All practices with many variations throughout West Africa. Men from a neighboring village capture Minka, battering him on the head and shoulders and then enveloping him in a net. The kidnappers drag him to British seamen waiting on the edge of Minka's receding world, the western shores of Africa. After being in prison for 2 days, Minka is shoved into the dim hold of a ship filled with Africans of diverse cultures and religious beliefs, bodies pressed together, shackled head to toe, once free in Africa, seasoned in Jamaica, and now enslaved in Alabama. The gatekeeper is forced to adopt and later embraces a new religion, blending African spirituality with the Protestantism of the enslavers. So we see a transformation that goes on here. There's a change, and there's a blending of cultures. Now, in Africa, there are African earth shrines, and this is a place of worship. And Minka, my fictionalized individual, was there as a spiritual leader at the shrine. The keepers of the shrine served as a bridge between earth and wilderness and civilization and agriculture, allowing people to push to the edges of frontiers as farmers. Generally, men were reverenced as spiritual leaders who guarded the shrines. Now, out of this, there is a Black ecotheology which began to evolve once Africans arrived in the Americas. There's an ecology or a spirituality also in Africa. The theology was more formalized by scholars during the 21st century. According to Marta Warnagaska, Black ecotheology is a religious approach that emphasizes the interconnections between human spirituality and liberation, environmental awareness and activism, and the special role of the Black population in these processes. One approach to interpreting nature is through Black ecotheology. It is a theology for and by African Americans who depend on God and Scripture to mentally, spiritually, and emotionally survive experiences like enslavement set against nature. So when we look back at Africa, Africans singly or in combination based their spirituality on higher powers and a distant spiritual world, including a single God and lesser divinities, veneration of one's ancestors, and believed in supernatural events, generalizations that varied across Africa. Now, broadly speaking, Africans believed in the interconnectedness, as was mentioned in the earlier quote, of the human, spiritual, and environmental realms, and felt that harm toward or care for one necessarily affected the others. And this kind of goes back to that quote that I'd read earlier. They believed that harm toward or care of one necessarily affected the others. In agriculture, there were life and death cycles in planting related to spirituality. Farmers consecrated the soil, sources of spirituality, nourishment, and life to people. They honored the dead with ceremonial burial while returning nutrients to the soil. So let's take a look at the Middle Passage and what they went through in the Middle Passage. Now, Africans, so fully formed in their spiritual beliefs, were violently yanked from Africa, their homeland. Through the Middle Passage, whites forcibly transported Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas to be enslaved from 1500 to 1875. There's an estimate that 20 million Blacks went one way across the Atlantic to the Americas. Now, note the image of the Africans packed body to body in the hold of the ship. In these holds, whites began to strip away the humanity of what they treated as cargo, as things. This was a method of control. Now, during this time, the meaning of life, religion, and nature were dramatically transformed for Africans. Trapped in a toxic organic stew for roughly 80 days, let's call it 3 months, they were chained closely together in the suffocating hold that you see in this image here. There was seasickness, vomiting in the hold of the ship, bloody flux, gory diarrhea. White sailors spread syphilis, raping Africans. Roaches, rats, mice, and lice abounded. Food and water was ladled into hands, and it was usually not sufficient for them to keep on their weight. Dead bodies lay next to people, and they were left there. They were periodically allowed above, but the sound of the endless water frightened many people. So let's take a look at enslavement. Once Africans arrived and they were sold, they were enslaved like animals. Whites ultimately referred to them as chattel, which means livestock or cattle or pigs. The very meaning of any connection to the environment, including cultivation of the land, was moved from freedom to oppression, from life giving to destruction. And that would be imposed on the Black bodies described by Ta-Nehisi Coates, from the people who were forced into brutalized labor without pay. An abuse, a destruction of Black bodies. Now consider some practical implications of straddling African and white religious influences in a new world. Know that aspects of African ecological spirituality were retained as African Americans drew on and blended in Protestantism, the primary religion of the enslavers. So what is the experience here in the United States, particularly with enslavement? There is fear and comfort. Fear includes runaways hounded by trackers and dogs in the woods. So it's no surprise that perhaps this fear has been passed on in generations here in the United States and remain with us today. There's also comfort. Temporary local runaways, they knew the terrain and knew how to hide and to hunt and get some respite from being on the plantation. Now, in this image here, it's a brush arbor. And it's a secret place in the woods beyond the watchful eyes of the slaveholder. These became sacred places, and they're tied to Africa in terms of worship outdoor and such a profound connection to nature. Here, African Americans gathered together in the brush arbors and used them for revivals and worship services during and after enslavement in the United States. African Americans worshiped in these outdoor spaces, often covered by branches for worship, including revivals, far from the gaze and control of the white slaveholders. There was also resistance. They broke farm implements, destroyed crops, slowed down work, and skipped feeding animals. So they did have an environmental impact, though it was limited. There's a blend. The two influences are joined together, which for African Americans is African and European. Now, I wanted to share a quote with you by George Pleasant, a slave who anticipated meeting his deceased wife in heaven or paradise, and that his corporeal body would no longer be of this earth. The inference is earth is no paradise, which Pleasant was prepared to leave. This is not to suggest, according to Sobel, that African Americans had not lost their special attachment to land, trees, rocks, and water. She argues that African Americans maintained such beliefs even after arriving from Africa to develop very deep attachments to place. African Americans had knowledge, including the environment, that benefited whites. So nature continues. There's this tension, this tug of war between nature being both negative and positive. So I wanted to share with you a video. It's based on the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. And there are so many references to nature. And I think she really gives a great depiction of worship in the woods, which ties us into the worship in the brush arbors. Let's go ahead and take a look at the video. So the environment is central to Beloved's plot, with many spiritual references to the woods, water, and animals. Toni Morrison also depicts a fictionalized African-American church in which the congregation retains Africanisms, such as the ring dance among the trees while practicing Protestantism or having church. Baby Suggs, as we see, is the unchurched pastor. So let's take a look at the 20th and 21st century. And I threw in a photo. I was in Mexico, and they have started cultivating the land for wines, and they want to become central in terms of wineries. And we'll see where that goes. There's always so much change and so much transformation that we don't expect. So 20th century music, I'm in the wrong century, and the environment. One of the amazing songs that I love is by Dinah Washington. It goes back to 1960. You may get a chance later on to look it up and listen to it. It's a beautiful, haunting song. It's This Bitter Earth. Now consider the context of a long history of violence of whites against Blacks, and this is perhaps why the earth is bitter to our musical artist. And that includes whippings during enslavement and lynching in the 19th and early 20th century. It's a song from the 1960s. And one of the lines is, "This bitter earth, what a fruit it bears. And if my life is like the dust, oh, that hides the glow of a rose, what good am I, heaven only knows." And I'm taking a bit of a leap that she's making a connection between the trying experiences of being African American and the connection to the environment. Let's take a look at Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. This is a protest song against whites lynching Blacks, primarily in the South. There are no ramifications for whites who are not held accountable through arrest and trials. Echoes what goes on today, including the murder of George Floyd. So Strange Fruit goes back to 1939. I want to share some of the lyrics before we listen. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. The environmental metaphor, our fruit, our bodies hanging from the trees. So let's take a listen. So we see here how landscapes are racialized and how there is a disconnect between being in the environment and feeling safe or unsafe. And if the hanging tree is what the woods means to somebody, if lynching is connected to it, it's very hard to make a connection with nature. So we fast forward to environmental justice, and environmental justice is defined as justice issues around the environment, and examples include inadequate access to healthy food, inadequate transportation, air and water pollution, and unsafe homes, and the list goes on. Robert Bullard, an academic, activist, and father of environmental justice, defines environmental racism as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, where intended or not intended, individuals, groups, or communities based on race. So just a little backdrop on the environmental racism movement, or the environmental justice movement, in response to the racism. In the 1980s, the environmental justice movement began in Warren County, North Carolina, with protest. In 1982, the state of North Carolina gave a company approval to illegally dump PCP contaminated soil in the African American community on their roads. Now, NAACP and leaders, Christian leaders, along with members of churches, mostly women, protested. This was the start of what would become a national environmental justice movement. And the trauma, the problems are not gone. We look at September 14th, 2021, a New York Times headline reads, "How the Storm Turned Basement Apartments into Death Traps." At least 11 people were found dead in basements after torrential rain floods in New York City. Nearly as many of those killed by Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, where the storm made landfall. Now, most of the people who died were poor, and some were Latinx. Many others were forced out of their flooded basement apartments and suddenly found themselves homeless. The answer in the 1980s and today is resistance. Contemporary places continue to be racialized and are real as they were during enslavement. Imagine resistance through farmers' markets springing up in urban food deserts, where there are no fruits and vegetables in the supermarkets for impoverished Blacks. Imagine African Americans demonstrating and demanding the government clean up tainted water flowing through the taps into homes in Flint, Michigan, and other places. Religious organizations like Trinity United Church of Christ and Black leaders are part of that work. And here in this image, there's Rosalind Priester, Pat Owens, and Adrian Wynn, and they are at an Earth Day at church, and they're encouraging people at their church, Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, to shrink their carbon footprint. So today, the battle is the blight of abandoned lots and overcrowded housing in impoverished urban neighborhoods, racialized landscapes. There are also places of hope. Today, community centers are surrounded by flower and vegetable gardens and pocket parks that provide shade on warmer afternoons in African American neighborhoods. And the hope is that there's more of this. The ruined places, in some instances, reclaimed abandoned lots and parks, are filled with people who fiercely hold on to their humanity, even when demonized and dehumanized by structural racism here in the United States. The fight for justice, including environmental justice, continues on behalf of marginalized people, some slaughtered against the backdrop of built city streets and lynchings in the rural woods. For too many, property remains property to be protected. Blacks continue to be treated as property, as chattel, not worthy of protection. And we go back to Ta-Nehisi Coates' Black bodies. We cannot continue to debase Black bodies. And there's a parallel. We are debasing the earth we inhabit. The injustice against Black people, Black bodies, is as important as sustaining the planet. And sometimes, more often than not, BIPOCs are treated with less dignity than the earth. Asthma, more prevalent among Black and brown children, cannot be separated from the destruction of the planet. There is a preponderance of Black and brown children compared to whites who have asthma. Now, justice for persons of color, that is justice for the planet. Now, what is your environmental story? And I want you to think about that as you consider some questions and even share something about yourself during the conversation that we're going to have after my talk. Does it revolve around your ancestors? Do you have narratives that you've heard from others? So what does environmental diversity, inclusion, and justice mean to you as a local community member, students and faculty? I know that there's a mix in terms of the audience that is here today. Just want to remind you that I do have a couple of books that are available, and they are available everywhere, including Amazon.com. So if you want to learn more, please do access my books. And I'm working on a forthcoming project, Black Eco-Theology Through History, the African American Perspective. So look out for that. So this is in Georgia, out hiking with a group. I wanted to thank you, and I hope that you go out, and if you're not doing so already, enjoy some green spaces, whether it's a local park, a state park, a national park, or you travel across the country. And you can contact me at dianneglave@gmail.com. So once again, I want us to think about these racialized landscape. I know I'm going back to some of the numbers that we had. 88% believe that there's a racialized, nature is racialized. 12% said no. And 94% in response to the second question, has race or ethnicity defined land ownership and access to green spaces? And 95% of you said yes, and 6% said no. So I'm hoping through some of this information that some of the nays will change their mind with some more data. Depends on your perspective, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. So I want to again thank you all, and so glad to be here. And I look forward to hearing your questions and your comments and your stories.
Great. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Dianne Glave. That was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
And a really good kind of end of semester for us. You touched on some of the themes that we've covered throughout class.
Good.
I just want to remind everybody to please put your question, or what did you say, Dan? You said question, comment, story, whatever you have.
Yeah, I love hearing people's stories. I learned so much. Somebody talking about a grandmother or great grandmother.
I love that. Yeah, so as much as possible, we would like this to feel less one-sided in the virtual world. So we would love to hear from you.
While people are thinking, thank you again for the presentation. I have a few questions. One is just, I want to get your perspective on the generalizations of African food culture and African American food culture, and what you understand as kind of that relationship and that evolving relationship. And how have you seen those two kind of in conversation, especially around what you're saying, eco-theology, which is something I'm really fascinated with.
I can speak from the perspective of my family. They're Jamaican. And I see so many African influences, including yam and banana. And, you know, I part of, I think, the communal and sometimes the religious experience is around food. But it's become so commercialized in some ways. I mean, we're fast food eaters. And so the communion that we once experienced through food has gone. And there's also a disconnect to all sorts of food. Some people don't even want to visualize how, you know, a steak ends up on their plate, but it doesn't happen magically. And I think that there, in the United States, African Americans and whites, there's a disconnect as to where all this comes from, and the history of recipes that are passed down, and the meaning of the food and the ritual around the food. So I think we've lost some of that. One of the things that I love about our country when we welcome immigrants is that they bring in, including Africans and people from the Caribbean, they bring in such richness in terms of the foodways, and they're closer to the stories about the recipes, the stories about the food. I mean, when I was a little girl, the typical thing that happened when people in the United States sent their kids down south to stay with grandparents and aunties and stuff like that. I was sent down to Jamaica, and I was a little girl, and I witnessed a hog being slaughtered, and we ate it, during the week. And I don't really feel like there was any trauma out of it. It was just what my grandparents did as farmers. So, my hope is that there's more connection in terms of our foodways and the richness that comes from so many cultures, because it gets monetized and it's homogenous in many ways. So hope we embrace different foodways.
Thank you.
And I have a question for you. I'm just wondering, I know you did at the beginning share a bit about yourself and different dimensions of your life, aspects of yourself, but was there like a particular experience or story or moment that made you want to study the intersection of African Americans and the environment and religion? Was there something that pulled it all together for you?
Well, I think that, I go back to my grandparents' story, and living in this sort of mixed suburban environment in Queens, New York. I think that my parents primed us for feeling comfortable outdoors, because we were just sort of let loose at this camp. So, but the pivotal point was when I went to graduate school. I was working on my MA, and then I was going to move on to my PhD. And I was my mentor, my advisor, she introduced me to environmental history, and I was like, where are the Black people? And I didn't see those stories. And there were some stories about Native Americans, but they were stereotyped in a lot of ways in the literature that was starting to evolve in the 90s. And so I said to my dissertation advisor, I was like, I want to write a book of the Great Migration of African Americans in an environmental context. And she says, you can't do that. So she says, what students do is they take something, they draw from established secondary literature, and they build from that, but they don't start building from primary sources and come up with something new. And I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. And so here we are. You really can't launch anything new. I didn't know what I was going to find at the archives, but the ancestors spoke to me, and I was able to tell the stories through Rooted in the Earth. So that was graduate school. It was a combination of things, but graduate school was pivotal. And then I went on to get my master's in divinity. And so, I mean, they reformed us to think theologically. And so it made sense for me to bring in the African spirituality and the Black eco-theology in the book that I'm working on now. And I've presented a little bit of it here in this lecture.
So I've noticed not a lot of, but I'm thinking of Michael Twitty's book, Kosher Soul, just more popular conversations around the interconnections between spirituality and food, especially in African American culture. Could you talk briefly about any kind of coalition or any partnerships across different spiritual practices, maybe that you've seen, or any insights that you can give around how people broadly are making these connections between food and spirituality?
I wish that I had an answer for that, but you bringing this up really has me thinking, and it's another strand that I need to draw on in terms of looking at Black eco-theology. So I wish I had more, but you've really sort of jump-started me in terms of thinking in a different way.
I think it would be a cool conversation. You and Michael Twitty going back and forth. I think there would be really fascinating points of common ground. You mentioned your next project. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that. It seems like an exciting direction.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little challenge while you're in the midst of writing. But I'm doing some case studies. I'm looking a little bit at Sojourner Truth and some of the things that she's been talking about in terms of creation. There's a brief excerpt from her narrative. I'm also looking at, why am I blanking? Moses of Her People, Harriet Tubman. I've actually written a chapter. You really can't separate this idea of resistance and her references to scripture and fleeing enslavement to go up north. Even when they landed finally in Canada, the shock of the cold, I know that she was praying because they weren't used to it. So it's all the sort of iterations that she went through, but teasing out the environmental references and what it meant to her. Linda Bren also talks about being in a nearby church and looking at her parents' grave and really sort of invoking the ancestors in that time where she remembers her parents. So drawing on different strands and just sort of trying to define what it means to be Black and ecological, and what it means for us today, because that in American society, you don't always bring in the religion. It's stripped out, or people are not comfortable with it. But if you look at the African experience, it's all interconnected. And we've separated, we've sort of set up silos of different parts of our lives, which is very different than the African experience. And it's a very spiritual one.
Dianne, I have a question for you, and perhaps Shakara will come in and talk more about it because she's closer to it than me. But I know that there's a group, at least in Detroit, I don't know if they're national or not, called Black to the Land Coalition. And I think it's a group of, I think that's really youth-based, but it's really, getting African Americans out in the outdoors and camping and hiking work. And I'm wondering, like, if there's a resurgence of these types of groups. And Shakara, feel free to say more about it if you would like to. If there's a lot of these groups around, if you feel like it's making substantial change in the relationship, yeah, I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
There is go ahead. Which one of us will go first? Okay, me? Okay. There is an organization which is national. It's actually called Outdoor Afro. And they have locations all over the country. And Rumap, she's African American. She founded the organization. And I feel like it's had a profound effect on Blacks being outdoor and being together outdoors. I do know that though I love nature, I have trepidations about, I'm always thinking, like, am I safe here? Even if an area is not, there's a park near me and there's no hunting involved, but it's always sort of in the back of my mind, and the hunting implications of hunting animals and hunting people. So I think that, when groups come together and it's a diverse group or it's African Americans, it's easier when there are 10 of us kind of going in and exploring a park in Georgia. And I've also noticed that when I go to some of these national parks, there aren't a lot of Africans and African Americans, and I'm very aware of it. So yeah, there's great work that's going on with Rumap and Outdoor Afro.
I see a question that kind of maybe builds from that. Someone's just asking if there are any good examples of communities that have intentionally focused on parks and nature spaces for BIPOC communities. And so Outdoor Afro seems to be one. I'm not sure if there are any others, but I know there are people who also do work on Black folks in the national parks as a system.
Yeah, and I'll try to find, there are several folks that are doing work. There's, I think it's called the Great Plains, and there's an African-American gentleman who's been central in terms of bringing young people into the plain spaces, doing work to sort of bring the areas back to what they were. But when I think of a couple of groups, I'll drop them into the chat or send them to you after our meeting.
And it looks like we have another question here. For those who struggle to discern the importance of the connections you're making, especially as it relates to environmental justice and anti-Black racism, do you have any recommendations for how we can lead people toward more understanding? I'm looking forward to reading your book and sharing those as resources.
Yeah, this is a challenge because I have been a diversity officer. That I finished that role in the United Methodist Church 2 years ago. And there's a lot of conversation A lot of studies where, is education actually working or does it make it worse? And I probably ended up walking away from it because it was like through my facilitation, are people digging in deeper? So it has to change through the institutions, and people in power need to make that change. And it includes environmental justice. I think that we need to target the structural problems when we make it more personal, and there's a group of 10 people and we're doing facilitation. People feel as if they're being attacked. So we have to get to a place where those that are in power are transformed and they lead in the transformation. So I'm not really sure. I mean, if somebody's a true believer and they read a book, then that's going to deepen their belief. But if somebody's forced to listen to a lecture on environmental justice and they don't believe, it just pushes them away. So my only answer is that it needs to be structural. And we see what's happening in Tennessee with the legislature. I think that is some glacial structural change after the 2 African-American men were kicked out of the Tennessee legislature. It's just time and power, people in power. And I'm so sorry that that facilitation hasn't worked. I spent 5 years on that. But the studies say that it deepens people's anger.
I want to thank you, Reverend Doctor, for sharing your work. And just to pick up the invite that Lily offered to share about Black to the Land here in Detroit. We're very similar to Outdoor Afro, just on a more localized level. And we were founded as an institution to facilitate Black people's reconnection to the land in particular, not just people of color more broadly, but particularly Black people, right, that have experienced enormous trauma related to the land, right? Like land and food has been used as a weapon very strategically against us. And at the same time, we can also use it as a very powerful method of resistance. And so we're facilitating that pivoting from oppression and trauma to a source of like resistance and reclamation, and facilitating community in these outdoor spaces. And so we do community hikes, we do like kayak rides on the river, just helping people get reacclimated to these very spiritual sites, as you articulate, which we're so thankful for. Right? Your literature is so impactful for the work, because we know that anything related to Black liberation has to be based in land. Like there's no other way around it, right? And so, we really appreciate all the work that you've done that has stewarded why Black to the Land and other institutions are needed at that level.
Absolutely.
Check us out. The website's in the chat.
Oh, thank you. It also makes me think about burial places. I mean, the burial location for slaves, those that were enslaved in Manhattan, there were buildings that were built over it. And now there is a sacred space. I believe it's closer to downtown Manhattan. And there's a little museum there. I've been in different parts of the South and seen locations that were specifically historically burial places for Blacks, and they're weeded and grown over. And the connection to our ancestors in terms of place has been demolished because whites have not treated our burial places in terms of reverence. So I think in terms of the land, this is an incredibly important connection. The historical sites that we have all over the South that need to be reclaimed. And we have an example through what happened in New York City with the slave community and the free community that was living there.
Yes, thank you. I don't think we often recognize the national parks also are over like monuments and conservation, and that having tangible evidence of people having been on the land or worked the land, especially also thinking about Indigenous communities as well, and those tie-ins. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and to me, I've been to the parks, including Tuskegee and Hampton, and these are also sacred places. We may not, in our secular sort of way, look at them, but all of the work that the ancestors did in terms of agriculture, and then in some ways were put down because Blacks wanted to be urban and they wanted to be professional. These are sacred places where African Americans had opportunities where other opportunities were not available. And so they learned a professionalized way of agriculture that allowed them to move from strictly sharecropping. They could manage, they could be scientists, teachers. When it came to agricultural education, they could lead nature study. So there was the conservation and the preservation side. So I see these Black historical these historical Black colleges as sacred places, and their archives are sacred because they tell the stories that have been subsumed by the powerful culture here in the United States that doesn't make our stories and our ephemera and the stories of land important, our voices. So.
And kind of tying on that, and this has been kind of a theme of the class, we're learning about the climate crisis from a lot of different angles. And oftentimes a response to that is like, what do I do? So you spend a lot of time in your talk, not only thinking about interconnected mediums, so how music also reflects historical experiences, also reflects a historical archive. How do you view that relationship between the collective and the individual? And what would you say to people who are kind of struggling with how to think through climate crisis? What has your research kind of taught you?
Well, I'm more of a storyteller myself, but I think it's important to keep track of what's going on, to read about what's going on and not pretend that a lot of people for the longest have been pretending that climate change isn't happening. But we see in developing countries in Asia that they are dealing with worse floods. We see in affluent areas in California that it's been a shock to them because they felt that they were shielded. There are just so many instances, and I think part of it is education, part of it is knowing. I'm just beginning to get connected to a local, I think it's I'm trying to remember the name of it. I'm going to do some volunteer work, but you can find some of your local agencies, preferably African American if you can. We have a Black organization here that focuses on reproduction and the concerns of Black women. And so I've started conversations with them. So we can do the sort of theoretical and the education, but there are opportunities right in the backyard. You don't have to travel, down south to get involved, and you can provide a limited amount of time in terms of volunteering, and it can be as simple as doing the table at the event or having conversations with people. I think one of the most profound things that's happened with one of the local agencies is predominantly white is that I sit down on a regular basis with the CEO, and he's been pivoting in some ways in response to reading some of the books about African Americans and having conversations with me. You just never know how you can influence somebody that's in power to make change and walk along with them.
I think we have time for one more. I know that Reverend Dr. Glave, you invited people to share stories and questions, and we just got one in the chat box. It's kind of a combination of a story and a question.
Oh, good.
Somebody who's writing in saying that they would like to connect with their ancestry, but they feel lost, and that generations, traditions, language, and stories have been lost, and that it's easy on their mom's side of their family, it's easy to track their Scandinavian, but their dad's side of the family is very big, and they feel like the ancestry is almost impossible to track. They're Mexican and Native American, and whenever they try, they hit dead ends. And so they're wondering if you have any advice or what you would advise for those who feel lost and don't know about their ancestry. How would they find connection with their roots?
And this is a good reminder to me. My dad's 92 years old. Our elders have a ton of stories, and a lot of times they're lonely. And so it's a great opportunity to sit down and, tape them or sketch out their story. There's some stuff that I circle back to about my mom. She passed away about 6 or 7 years ago, and my dad's like, "That's wrong," So he's still alive, and it's an opportunity for me to get these narratives on a very, local, personal level. So it's the same thing with the research that I did. There was a story that I had in mind that I wanted to write, but it was the archives that told me what direction, the voices of the people that I studied in the archives that led me in the direction. So I don't think that there needs to be sort of like this big plan. I think that the ancestors in the plan will tell us what we need to know. And even if it's not directly in your family, do some reading in terms of your country, your place of birth, or how you're connected as an immigrant, and learn. And just talk to anybody who are family and friends and learn their stories and ask them questions and listen carefully.
That's beautiful. I feel like we can all do that.
Take the
My
time.
only
It's
my only
hard.
concern is if I sit down with my parents and ask them to start telling me stories, that they're going to think that I'm trying to say that they're about to go.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it also happens naturally. I think my dad is more willing to tell the stories when some of my friends come over.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because my dad, for example, he was born in Cuba. He's not Spanish speaking, but his parents migrated to Cuba to work. So culturally, they went back, and he's Jamaican.
Mm.
I hear more about this stuff because it's more like a neutral person has come into the
I can see
household.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes having a third party there who the stories in his mind, they're new to the person that's coming by to visit. He tells them all sorts of stuff. And I'm like, wait, what?
Bust out you invite somebody over and bust out your recorder.
Right. Or just take some mental notes and sketch it out so it doesn't seem awkward. Because I've been writing down some of the stories that he's been telling me.
Yes, another note for connection with others, that the way to understanding this issue, to understand our relationship with land, is through connection with others. So we cannot do it alone. I think we are gonna wrap up.
Yeah, I think we
Yeah.
can wrap up. So everybody, we have one more class. Thank you for joining us, both students and community members throughout the semester. One last class. It's going to be with the course team, and we're going to try to synthesize what we've been learning together, what we've been learning about throughout this whole semester. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, especially to Dianne Glave. It was so nice to have you here.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, and we will see you next week.